I always identified so much as someone in a bigger body that I was like, starvation. I don't know how to starve myself. I was just doing what everyone told me to do. And so that's what was going on physically. So from that point, it has to start there because that became where things got very, very complicated and confusing for me because my entire life I ate whatever I want. I was completely dissociated and disconnected and mindless about it. Then I was hyper fixated and hyper focused on every morsel that went into my body, every calorie I burned, every step I took. Now I had to backtrack and I had to eat more and exercise less. And that is what brought up all the emotion that was really underneath all of it. Because now I was realizing I was terrified of eating food. I was terrified of taking a day off the gym. I was fueled by fear and terror. And I had no idea how I got to that point.
Do you want to wake up feeling like you're stepping into who you're meant to be, into the best possible version of you? What if I told you that the key to your best life, health, and happiness are all around you? You just have to find what works for you. I'm Hope Pedraza, and I believe that there isn't just one way to live a healthy and meaningful life, and that all you need is a little inspiration to make changes that last from the inside out. Each week, I'll be sharing tangible tips and inspirational interviews to help you on your journey. These are the steps to take to improve your life and live with purpose. This is Hopeful and Wholesome. Hey y'all, welcome back to Hopeful and Wholesome. Today I have on the show Lisa Schlosberg, and I love this conversation with Lisa because I just love Lisa. I was on her podcast last year. Her podcast is called Out of the Cave, and you can go check it out. We'll talk a little bit about it on the show. But she has such a great story, and she uses her platform to really share her story and her journey and help those with disordered eating behaviors. And that's what we talk about on this episode of the show today, is about that mind-body connection around disordered eating and disordered eating behaviors. And there's a lot of brain science of emotional eating and dieting, and really explains a lot around why physical interventions alone don't work. And for some people, they don't work at all. And this is what Lisa helps her clients with. And so we're going to talk about her journey, about, some of the similarities between my journey with food, her journey with food. And it's just such an enlightening conversation and really brings a little bit of a different perspective on disordered eating behaviors and really kind of that emotional, spiritual piece that kind of lies underneath it that a lot of interventions don't address. And I just love this really empowering conversation. If you know anybody in your life, or if you yourself listening have ever dealt with disordered eating behaviors, you're currently dealing with disordered eating behaviors, or again, you have a friend or family member, send them this episode and then send them over to Lisa's podcast, Out of the Cave, because it will transform so much of the mindset around this. It can really be helpful on their path to healing. So let's jump in.
All right, y'all, let's jump in. I'm here with Lisa, and I'm so excited to have Lisa on. I had the pleasure of being on Lisa's podcast earlier this year, and now it's her turn. So thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yes, I'm so happy to have you. And I know we talk a lot about our own personal journeys with like food and all of that stuff, but I would love for you to share with my listeners just kind of a look into your story and your journey and to where you got as, the coach that you are.
Okay, great start. So hello, everybody. My name is Lisa. I am a trauma-informed health coach, and I work specifically with people who are struggling with food and eating and their body in really any way. That could be overeating, undereating, mindless eating, emotional eating. And I come in and really work with that from a mind, body, soul perspective. So that's what I do and who I work with. But the very, very, very long story short of how I got to where I am, I always say, as soon as I could feed myself, I was eating too much. So my childhood was just continuous weight gain. My earliest memories of going to the pediatrician was being overweight, obese, morbidly obese, as the BMI chart would call it. And I was over 300 pounds when I was 17 years old. So for me, that's kind of what growing up looked like out here in the physical dimension when it came to food and eating in my body. But I always like to pair that with what was going on internally and my emotional kind of environment growing up. And the way that I grew up and coped as a kid was really just denial and defense and avoidance. I don't feel things. Feelings are stupid. Therapy is a waste of time. I am strong enough to handle everything myself, and I don't need help from anyone. And so I start there because that really illustrates how I was using food and eating like a drug to stuff down everything that was true for me. So I didn't pay attention to what I was thinking or what I was feeling or what I needed or connecting with other people. I just lived in this place of really disconnection and dissociation, and food and eating allowed me to maintain that. And then when I got to college, I kind of went from one extreme to the other. I never checked in with myself about how I was feeling or what I needed. I wasn't feeling feelings yet. I just kind of swung the pendulum to the other side. Instead of overeating, it was undereating. Instead of disconnecting from my feelings with food, I was disconnecting from myself with restricting food. And I lost 150 pounds very rapidly, very quickly. I always like to say there's nothing magical about it. I went on a diet. It was very extreme. I was under eating. I was over exercising, and it did get the weight off my body. But then things got very interesting because that's what really opened me up to. At the end of my weight loss, I was malnourished. I was in starvation mode. My hair was falling out. I lost my period. I was so unhealthy physically and mentally, emotionally. I was basically in a full-blown eating disorder, but I had no idea why. I felt like I had just followed all the rules everyone taught me: eat less, exercise more. And then that's where I say it got very interesting, because I had this big like emotional upheaval that a lot of people who've ever been in recovery for alcohol or drugs experience, where now without food and eating or dieting and weight loss to distract me and disconnect me from myself, the truth started making itself known. And I started becoming a very emotional, sensitive, vulnerable human being without these, really what I call now like my life jackets. They were the things that helped me feel safe. And so that was over a decade ago now. And I have been living, really prioritizing my mental and emotional and spiritual well-being as a holistic human rather than a body. I don't count what I eat. I don't get on the scale. I feel really, free and empowered around food. And that's how I arrive at this place of really doing the deeper work with the people that I work with, because many of us know how to eat, quote unquote, but it's the blocks that are coming up along the way that I get very passionate about helping people through. So that again, if you want the really, really long version, you can go to my podcast and listen to that. But that is how I got to where I am, and kind of the story that is underneath the work that I do.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And it really is an inspiring story just to listen to the journey and then you coming out on the other side of it. So when you kind of went to the other extreme, when you went to college, were you intentionally trying to lose weight? Was it like something where you're like, oh, well, I'm overweight, so now that I'm on my own, I can, like, what was how did that part kind of flip flop?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I got to college, and it was actually the year before college, I took a gap year. So I was traveling alone. And that was the very first time in my life that I decided maybe I should try and actually do something about my weight, because like I said, I was overweight my whole life. So there was no shortage of, realizing that it was a quote unquote problem.
Right.
But now it was the first time that I was out of my home and I was really by myself, which I think has so much to do with it just psychologically, right? You can't heal in the same environment that made you sick. So for me, I was away from the family, the trauma and things that were happening there in that environment. And I think that's why I didn't think about it this way at the time, but I think that's what opened up the space for me to say, I am my own person, and how do I want to live? And I remember on my way, I was in New Zealand actually. And on my way to New Zealand, I had a really hard time fitting myself into a bathroom stall in the airport in Australia. And that is what I would call the closest thing I had to like an aha moment, because I remember kind of like hanging my head in my hands on the toilet and just thinking, I am 17 years old. Like, I don't want to live like this. And then I got on the plane and I needed a seatbelt extender. And it was like at this point in my life where things were my body was getting in the way of me being
Mm-hmm.
able to move and live and travel. And so that was kind of what started waking me up. And so I started my weight loss there, and it was very intentional. It was like, okay, now I'm gonna do this thing. And I had spent a few months there before I went to college. My freshman year of college, I just said, there's too much on my plate. There's too much going on. I kind of like abandoned it for a year. And then it was after that that I went like full on gung ho back on Jenny Craig, which is where it all started for me. And so it was very intentional at that point.
Yeah.
And I just thought, right, I'm going to do what everyone always told me to do. I'm going to make the sacrifices I have to make. I'm going to eat less food or different food. I'm going to start exercising, even though I hate it. And I just remember thinking, the way that I framed it to myself, which is so funny and cute to think about now, is I remember thinking like, this is going to suck and this is going to be so hard. So I'm just going to like close my eyes, white knuckle my way through it and do what I got to do.
Yeah.
And I thought I would come out on the other side having lost a lot of weight. And then I would just get back to my old way of doing it. I was like, then I'll have all the pizza and all the cheeseburgers and I'll go back to never working out ever again. And, this is just going to be a temporary quick fix. And it was really the beginning of like a spiritual awakening,
Wow.
So that's kind of how that happened.
Yeah, that's wild. Well, and the other interesting part about that is that it turned into this spiritual awakening for you. But I find it interesting because so when you finally you had, lost a lot of weight at once, and then you kind of, like you said, you realized that all the stuff you were trying to cover up is now you don't have anything else to cover it up with and all these things. Like that just kind of happened on its own, right? Throughout your journey. Like you weren't like actively seeking help for your eating disorder. Like, so what was that part where it's like all of a sudden, because I think I find that has to be a really inspiring piece for a lot of people listening because yes, not saying that you can't go to, rehab places and I have had clients too that have gone through that themselves. Like that's a real thing. But the fact that you somehow in there had the wherewithal to like recognize what was going on and then like, hold on, like there's something here.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you asked this. I like wish more people did sometimes. Yeah. So what happened was I felt, and I can pinpoint like exactly where I was on the journey at a certain point. All my weight had come off, and I remember first physically. So I always split. There's like what was going on physically and then what was going on emotionally and mentally. What was going on physically was I couldn't tell. I didn't know why I felt so bad. Like I was fatigued all the time. I was irritable. I was seeing black spots every time I stood up. I felt I was in college. I couldn't memorize anything. Like I couldn't study. And I felt like my body just wasn't working and I didn't know why. So I went to all these different doctors. I went to 4 doctors. I went to my parents' doctor, my pediatrician, an endocrinologist, and an OBGYN. And every single one of them said the same thing. Congratulations on your weight loss. This is the healthiest you've ever been. Wow. And I remember being like I was and I say that because I think so many people, especially people who are in bigger bodies, fall through the cracks of the medical model because it didn't fit, it didn't fit. They looked at the weight chart and they said, congratulations,
right?
Maintain your weight for a while and your body will start to come back. And it wasn't until I spoke to a nutritionist, and a nutritionist said to me, I got on the phone with her and I thought I was going to be so impressive. And I was telling her about my tiny little breakfast and then no snack, and my vegetables for lunch and no snack, and my tiny little dinner and no snack. And I remember thinking like, I don't know how she's going to tell me to eat any less, but if that's what I have to do to lose the last 10 pounds, then that's what I got to do. And I remember she was the one that said to me, hey, Lisa, are you still getting your period? And I was like, that is so crazy that you asked me that, because I just for the first time in my life, I missed my period. How in the world did you know? Like I had no idea. And so she was the one that said to me, okay, so here's what's going on. Like this is called starvation mode. Your body is literally fighting you to keep weight on. And so we need to kind of surrender for now the goal of weight loss. Like we need to not be thinking about the last 10 pounds. We need to really restore your body and restore your health. And at that point, I remember it was like 1 year later, I remember being like, I always identified so much as someone in a bigger body that I was like, starvation. I don't know how to starve myself. I was just doing what everyone told me to do. And so that's what was going on physically. So from that point, it has to start there, because that became where things got very, very complicated and confusing for me. Because my entire life, I ate whatever I want. I was completely dissociated and disconnected and mindless about it.
Right.
Then I was hyper fixated and hyper focused on every morsel that went into my body, every calorie I burned, every step I took. Now I had to backtrack, and I had to eat more and exercise less. And that is what brought up all the emotion that was really underneath all of it. Because now I was realizing I was terrified of eating food. I was terrified of taking a day off the gym. I was fueled by fear and terror. And I had no idea how I got to that point. Like, I remember being like, I followed all the rules. I did a really great job. I got all the gold stars of weight loss. But I remember at this point, I remember crying on the phone to my mother saying, this is the least I've ever weighed and the least happy I have ever been. And I don't know how that happened. And so that's what opened up all of this like inner conflict and inner turmoil and the fear and terror of really living with an eating disorder where every thought was about food and my body. And so I remember at this point, and I think this is important because at that time, it didn't feel like my own. It felt like all the voices of objectifying my body and being scared of food, it didn't feel like me. I remember journaling about, I feel like I've been infiltrated by some outside force. And now I have all these like demonizing thoughts in my head, but these aren't mine. Like, where did all of this come from? And that was really the impetus for me to reach out to my childhood therapist to say, I am not doing well. And I don't know how I got here. I don't know how to get out. I don't know what happened. I need help. And then for a certain point, I was talking to my therapist and that nutritionist once a week. And it was like the nutritionist was making sure I was eating enough. I had a meal plan at a certain point because I remember her saying to me, this is, these are anorexic tendencies. This is how I treat my anorexic patients. And so hand in hand with that, I really needed the mental and emotional support of my therapist once or twice a week, because I was so just like unwell. And I had no idea how I ended up there. But that's really the support I needed. And so it was like one step at a time, eating a little bit more, exercising a little bit less, learning how to feel my feelings and talk about things and express things rather than eat them or count them, whatever came before that. So that's kind of how, and I will just speak really quickly to what the emotional upheaval felt like, because that's kind of where your question was like, what brought all that on? And that's how it happened step by step. But I remember at a certain point realizing I was crying about everything. I remember realizing like rain and babies and weddings and commercials. Like, I was just sappy all the time. And I grew up as this, like, I'm too tough to feel anything. So it was like a total identity crisis. But then I remember going into therapy one day and realizing that nothing had actually changed. There was always rain. There was always weddings and babies and commercials. There were always these things. It was me that was different, and the way that I was moving through the world. And it felt like, I remember saying, it felt like my shield of armor was gone. And I know that that's true for a lot of people who lose a lot of weight. There's this emotional, it just felt like I was cracked open and I was very raw and vulnerable without that protection and without that defense against the world and a lot of other things. So that's why and how it became a mental, emotional, spiritual journey of opening up and unraveling in some ways into telling the truth.
Yeah. When you're working with your clients, I'm just thinking, like, knowing from, my own journey and then listening to you and your journey, it's because, like, for you had the period where the nutritionist was helping you eat more, right? Which is very counterintuitive. but then that was when you realized your fear, like, oh, this whole time I haven't been eating because I've been afraid, and you didn't realize it until then. And I find that a lot of people, even people that aren't necessarily like, maybe using air quotes, anorexic, like they're not like full diagnosed, or they feel like they maybe they didn't even recognize themselves as having, eating disorder or disordered eating tendencies or whatever. But help, like when they recognize that, like you're saying, like being hyperfixated on food and counting and just basically being like either OCD about it or just completely like, obsessed with it. And how, like, what is the process that you take people through to kind of untangle those parts? Because it's not as simple as just saying like, oh, well, you just need to eat more. Because I mean, like you're saying, there's this mental emotional piece attached, and that's always the hardest part. It's the like rewiring of your brain, right? And because I find too that especially if, and I'm not trying to offend anyone, but especially if you don't quote look like you have an eating disorder, do you know what I mean? Like you're not stick skinny, or you're not like the picture in the textbook. That's the girl who's bulimic, whose bones are poking out everywhere. Then you're like, well, it's not a problem because I'm not super skinny. So it can't be a problem if I'm not the textbook version of like a bulimic or anorexic, you know what I mean? So what is the kind of some of the process that you take people through? Because I think the awareness piece is probably the first one, I'm assuming, but then kind of walking through the rest of that, like to unpeel back those layers of the reasons why they're so obsessive and, all that.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's so much that I could say to answer this question. The first is, and I appreciate you bringing this up because I always mention it when I'm teaching, that we have, to your point, what we picture as like the person that struggles, right?
Yep.
But there's also now some people use the phrase atypical anorexia because, right, for me, it's like I was starting at like 300 pounds. So I wouldn't fit anorexia in the textbook sense of the word,
Right.
because my weight wasn't in that place. But a lot of people who are in bigger bodies have anorexic tendencies,
Right.
because there's so much fear of more
Yep.
weight gain, fear of their doctors telling them that their weight's the problem. Like the fat phobia in the culture has contributed to so many people in bigger bodies that struggle with disordered eating tendencies or habits that go completely, again, missed and overlooked by not just the culture, but the medical providers themselves, and especially. So I think that's just a really important point, because especially when I'm working with people who are in bigger bodies, it's exactly what you're saying, where we've internalized the belief so much that, for example, anorexia looks this way.
Right.
And this couldn't possibly have anything to do with me because I look this way.
Yep.
And so I think it's a really important point for anyone who's listening to this, because there is a difference between our behaviors and our body size. And it's actually very disappointing to me, because even when I look at the research that's being conducted around binge eating disorder is often they're being researched in people with bigger bodies. And then anorexia is being researched in people in smaller bodies. And it's like the bias is so embedded in just the way that we medically understand these conditions. But it's very important to understand, one is our behavior, overeating, undereating, one is our body size. So even if you're listening to this and you're in a thinner body and you're like, it's not a problem because I'm thin, right? But what happens at 10 p.m. when you're binging on the food in your kitchen, and that doesn't feel very good. So it's not about the size of your body or what number, jeans you're wearing. It's about the internal experience of how safe and stable you feel around food and eating in your body in a general sense. That's what we need to pay attention to. But I think, we've internalized the way of thinking that is objectifying ourselves. If I look this part, then I'm okay. If I look this part, I'm not okay. But it completely neglects your internal lived felt experience that we have around food every day. So that's the first point that I just think is so important and valuable, because again, if we're in bigger bodies, and this happens with so many people I work with, when I suggest, maybe you're not eating enough, right? Because some people, like myself, at a certain point, I was in starvation mode. My body couldn't lose a pound. So there's a reason that happens if we're chronically, severely underfed.
Right.
And sometimes when I'm working with people in larger bodies, it's like, of course they're not eating enough because they're terrified of food, because their doctors have told them over and over again that food is the problem and their weight is the problem. So someone who's, let's again use it, just examples, 300 pounds. Okay, well, if we actually look at what are you eating every day, it could be 1,000 to 1,500 calories.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, no wonder you, not only that you can't lose weight, but that you feel so irritable and so
Mm-hmm.
fatigued and exhausted and like
Mm-hmm.
you have no fuel,
Right.
right? And so it's important to understand that, because it really, I've seen the way it wakes people up, because the first response they have is, oh, I couldn't possibly be underfed,
Mm-hmm.
right? And instead of, so this is an invitation to anyone who's listening to this, instead of just kind of buying into that belief, right? It's like, do an inventory. Like, really honestly look at, what are you eating every day?
Mm-hmm.
Roughly, we're not counting and tracking anything, but roughly ballpark, how many calories actually is that? Because for so many people, that is the moment of awakening. That
Yep.
is like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
I am so underfed for
Mm-hmm.
my weight. Now it makes sense why things are the way they are. But again, we've just been so indoctrinated by that belief system that it really takes this moment of waking up, telling the truth and looking at it, not from a place of good and bad and right and wrong and shouldn't, but am I fueling and nourishing myself the way that I need to
Right.
survive as a human being?
Right.
So that's that. And then, I mean, it speaks to how I would answer the question in a general sense. That is, what's the process of walking people through it? I think the very beginning of the program, at least for, my curriculum and the way I teach people, is we need to completely reorient to what it is to be a human being.
Mm.
So one of the, a couple things I say is always, you're a spiritual being having a physical experience,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're not a physical being having a spiritual experience.
Mm-hmm.
You are a soul. You have a body.
Yes.
Not the other way around.
Right.
So we need to, if we're going to talk about food and eating in the body, we need to zoom all the way out and
Mm-hmm.
start with the basics of understanding what you even are.
Yep.
And really starting there. And then from that point, unpacking a lot of, where did we get the idea? Where did we get the idea that thinner is better?
Mm-hmm.
Where did we get the idea that exercise is for weight loss?
Mm-hmm.
Where did we get the idea? Like, where did all of this come from? Because we did not come out of the womb
Right.
with this knowledge, right? So a lot of the beginning of the process is unpacking and kind of unraveling a lot of the things we think we know to be true,
Mm-hmm.
and understanding this is because of the diet culture. This is
Right.
because of the patriarchy. This is
Right.
because of, capitalism and consumerism and so I always say, like, untangling that and rewiring around that creates the space for us to say, so if I'm not believing all of this stuff that I was taught that hasn't been serving me, what do I believe?
Mm-hmm.
What do I think? What do I feel? What is my opinion? Who am I underneath all of that? So it really
Right.
begins with deconstructing the conditioning to create space for authenticity to arrive.
Yeah. Yeah. That's huge. That's huge. Thank you for outlining that. And that, I mean, I agree with everything that you're saying there. And it's crazy how, like, the part about untangling all the things, that's crazy. Like, just today, I saw this Instagram video. It blew my freaking mind. I'm going to have to listen to the whole episode. There's some, and I can't even remember the name of the podcast to tell you what to listen to, but some guy, I mean, the guy leading the podcast is a big name guy, but anyway, he had this guest on talking about how, like, talking about the cereal industry and how, like, back in the, I don't know, whenever General Mills and all those cereals came out, it was like the guy that was heading up, I want to say General Mills, was this really conservative guy who was trying to, like, basically he was saying that the sugar and the carbs in the food is basically lowering guys' testosterone, and it was to keep them from, like, having too much testosterone so they wouldn't masturbate. Like, I was totally blown away. It was all because he knew what would happen when they ate, like, the processed stuff and what happens to your hormone levels and all this. And he was like, so basically it was like, masturbation was a sin, and he wanted men to be, I'm like, I was just mind blown. But, like, the reason that came in my head is I'm like, all this stuff we've been taught about, like you were saying, like, whoever said exercise was to lose weight, and, like, thinking about the patriarchy and consumerism, all these things, like, we've been indoctrinated with so many things that we don't even recognize anymore about food and what food is and what food means and exercise. Like, it's that piece, I mean, that could be a whole, like, process in and of itself.
Totally. And that's such a cool story. And it literally doesn't shock me at all, because the things that I've heard, like, and part of it, so I went to, graduate school I got my master's in social work,
Mm.
and everything, like part of the thing that I love about grad school is that, I'm studying social work, but I get to write papers about like the things that really matter to me. And so everything I studied was about the food industry and the
Mm-hmm.
psychology of feeding and eating and
Mm-hmm.
child development and all the things. And I
Yeah.
was just putting it all together. But so, I had to take policy classes and I had to write about, the economy, and I have to write about the food industry and things like that. And so I just learned so much about, like we're taught as kids to, for example, now it's my plate, right? But it used to be the food
Yes.
pyramid.
Yes.
So we're
Yes.
taught really early on, this
Exactly.
is how you eat. This is
Mm-hmm.
the way that food
Mm-hmm.
works. And it's like, okay, cool. But where did that come from?
Uh-huh.
Who created who
Uh-huh.
created the food pyramid,
Yep.
right? And then
Yep.
it's like, oh, well, there's all these ties to like the agriculture and like all the things of what the government is subsidizing because it wants us to eat a certain way
Yep.
because of
That's where
money
the
and
money is. Yeah.
profit and
Yeah.
right. And it's
Yeah.
like when and this is where like when I joke with my clients, I'm like, this is where I start to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it's
Right.
like it's just a hundred
It's just
percent
the
true that
facts.
when
Right.
right when you
Mm-hmm.
start doing your research around why do you think what you think?
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that you believe this is right or wrong or good
Right.
or bad? Where did you learn it? And
Yep.
also, how is it that we think what we think over here in this time and space, but in a
Exactly.
different country at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, or at the same country at a different time,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's all cultural relativism is something I
Yeah.
teach about because we think this is the capital T truth because the government told me that. And
Right.
it's like, why do you think they did?
Right.
And all of that it's a huge unraveling
Mm-hmm.
because that's where people get to a point where they're like, I feel so lied to and I feel so angry. Like, I don't want to listen to the medical model anymore. I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
listen to the food industry anymore. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, yeah, so we take that really into our own hands
Right.
and get curious about how do we actually nourish and support ourselves
Right.
without all those voices
Right.
about how to do it and what to do. So
Yep.
it's a huge part of the learning and the unlearning, the
Unlearning.
learning,
Yeah.
the relearning, like all
Mm-hmm.
of it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's a huge piece. Oh my gosh. I could talk about that all day because I can imagine, especially you studying that, I can imagine the stuff that you know. So it's a huge thing. So I think like moral of the story of that part, y'all, is like do your research. Like you don't have to
Yeah.
believe everything you hear. So, there's that. Oh my gosh, this is so good. I need to wrap up here to respect your time, but I want to ask, I do have another question I want to ask you. But before I ask you that, can you let everybody know where they can find out more about you, your podcast, which is full of so much good nuggets of wisdom and helping people on this journey, just all the places.
Yes, thank you. So my Instagram is a great place to find me, Lisa.Schlosberg, Schlosberg. And then my podcast is the Out of the Cave podcast. It's on Apple and Spotify. And then my website is outofthecave.health. So that will have more information about my program, how to work with me, et cetera. But you can always feel free to email me, lisaschlosberg@gmail.com, or just slide into my DMs on Instagram and we'll take it from there.
Awesome. So good. And of course, Lisa, all that'll be in the show notes. So I can go and definitely go subscribe to Lisa's podcast. There's a lot of good
Thank
stuff
you.
there. So yes, so such good stuff on there. Okay. The last question I want to ask you before we move, what do you think is the most important thing you can do to live with purpose?
Great question.
Hmm.
I think the answer to that is really be on your own team. Like there's enough, it's already hard enough. There's already enough going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in terms of living, like to me, how I even understand this question is living on purpose with purpose is like really living in alignment with yourself. And the best way I know how to do that is to get out of your own way so that you can be in connection with yourself. And that is self-compassion. That is self-love. That is being the person and the support that you want and need and desire, being on your own team, treating yourself with kindness, forgiveness, flexibility, just supporting yourself along the way. And sometimes self-compassion is more tender and about acceptance. And sometimes self-compassion is a little bit more fierce and it's about taking action and doing something. But I think the more I do this work, the more I realize really what we're doing is just coming home to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't feel safe which is to say we're in a habit of judging and critiquing and criticizing and shaming and blaming. It doesn't feel safe to come home to self. So I think self-love, compassion, empathy toward you is the best way to get on your own team and ultimately fire up your purpose and passion and the life you want to live.
Yeah. That was such a beautiful answer. Thank you, Lisa. So well spoken. Thank you so much. Thanks for sharing your story and all of this that you're bringing. I know everybody's going to go check out your podcast. And if y'all are dealing with your own journey with food, you have someone in your life on their own journey or struggle with food, like y'all reach out to Lisa, find Lisa, and she'll help you work through all the things. Thank you so much, Lisa. This is so fun.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Hopeful and Wholesome, y'all. If you found value in this week's episode, please subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcast and leave a review to let me know what you thought. I'd love to know what you find useful in these episodes so I can know how to provide the most value I can to my listeners. And if you have topics you'd like to know more about, I'd love to hear those as well. So shoot me a message on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. It's @TheHopePedraza, or you can visit my website, hopefulandwholesome.com. Thanks, y'all.